Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Quinn Buckland, and today I am talking about two books that cover the apocalypse and with some fairly religious undertones, sometimes overtones. Today I am covering The Stand by Stephen King and Swan Song by Robert McCammon. Which one of these is the better book? What tells a better story? Which one has the better characters? Which one has the better villains? So on and so forth. Now, I'm going to have to be a little, honest with this. This is not going to be as fair of a fight as one would think, considering Swan Song is my favorite book of all time, whereas I found The Stand to really just only kind of be okay. But that was really just in my opinion and my personal enjoyment of the books. I'm going to have to come at both of these books with a little bit more of an analytical mind and a little bit more honesty in terms of which aspects I actually found to be better. So, without any further ado, let's get started. So, first of all, I want to talk about the plot, because neither book would be anywhere without their plots. The plot for The Stand goes on as a virus called Captain Trips, or at least is mostly called Captain Trips, basically kills 99% of the population of the planet. And the survivors, split into both good and evil, either go to Boulder, Colorado. I've chosen a few do end up going to Hemingford Home, Nebraska. I think it's Nebraska. Anyway, they end up going to Hemingford Home to find Mother Abigail, and they go to Boulder, Colorado, and that's where they stay. Where the ones that are classified as evil or bad or corrupted end up going to Las Vegas. And this eventually culminates into a bit of a fight between good and evil. Now, it's not a bad plot. I mean, that's obviously in a very, very condensed nutshell. Swan Song details the aftermath of the nuclear explosions and the survivors and trying to survive, both in the immediate aftermath and 7 years later during the nuclear winter. It follows Josh and Swan, Josh being an ex-wrestler and Swan, who was a little girl during the time of the explosion, and her kind of growing up and detailing her powers. I'll get into Swan and Josh and all them later. And basically the bad guys, at least the bad guys of this story, and their army of excellence, which is almost a sort of Nazi mirror in a sort of way. And it shows a lot of what they are doing. Now, which plot is better? This is a really, really tough one because both have very strong plots, and well, I definitely did not detail or did not explain either plot very well, mostly because it would take forever to go through them, because there's just so much stuff that happens in both books. This one's tough, but I think I'm going to give this one to The Stand. That's not to say that Swan Song does not have a good plot. It absolutely does. But The Stand, I think, just has that little bit more of a plot to it. It's a little basic, the whole good versus evil thing, but Swan Song also has a lot of good versus evil to it. So it's kind of up and down. Swan Song, if I was to give it any real points over The Stand in terms of plot, is what the characters mean to the story in and of itself, but the characters and the plot should be very different things. The characters are a part of the plot, they drive the plot, but that's about as far as it goes. The Stand just has that little bit more in terms of plot. So, next up is main characters, and the main characters of Swan Song detail around Swan, Josh, and Sister Creep. Swan, being a little girl during the time of the explosion, is a little girl during the time of the explosion. She's very sweet, she's very charming, she's very nice. And everyone seems to really like her. I mean, she's not like Mary Sue level, everyone loves her, but it's she's a 7-year-old child and we must protect her, kind of like her. You have Josh, who is an ex-wrestler and has sort of taken on the role of Swan's guardian. And then you have Sister Creep, who is essentially the bearer of the glass ring. Now, the glass ring is a bit of an interesting item. It's kind of like a crown, really. But that's later on in the book. And I don't really consider that a spoiler because it's mentioned as kind of being crown-shaped pretty early on. Anyway, these characters are fantastic. I absolutely love these characters. I fell in love with them almost right off the get-go because they seem very real. They seem very interesting to me. So it really wasn't hard for me to get behind these characters. I genuinely loved them. But I am going to have to admit that outside of who they are, there's really not outside of how they're portrayed in terms of the story, there really doesn't seem to be a lot more to them. Swan being a little girl, there's not really much of a past for her. She has a special power that I'll get into a little bit later. Josh does have an estranged family, but it's not really explored all that far. He brings it up a lot throughout the book, who they are, the potential of them surviving weighs heavy on him, but it just doesn't. And Sister Creep being a bag lady from New York, and her whole journey, it just doesn't really. As much as I love the characters, I found it just didn't really hold. It just doesn't hold as much as, say, The Stand does, which I'm gonna get into right now. The Stand has a lot of main characters. It has Larry, Stu, Franny, Nick, Tom, Ralph. And those are the ones that I can remember off the top of my head that are not classified as the villains. There are a lot of characters, but you kind of get a lot of time with them, and you really get to explore their past and who they are. And there's more than just one aspect to their past that you get to explore. Nick, you really get to explore who he is and how being born deaf and mute really affects him as a character. Is it well written? Well, I can't really say that in that pretense. Same as Tom Cullen's mental illness, I really can't say one way or another if it's a good representation of it. Probably not, but me not being disabled, it's really hard for me to say. Franny is an interesting character all the way through. I mean, she is probably the least interesting character all the way through, but she's still interesting. Stu is, he's kind of a bland main character, but he is fairly dynamic in a lot of ways, and he's very good with what he wants to do, and he's sort of the man with the plan. Nick, he's sweet, he's charming, he's a very, very genuinely nice person all the way through. Ralph is probably the character you get the least amount of character of, and even then, you get to really like his character. He's just a genuinely decent person. And then you have Larry. Larry is kind of a bit of a scuzzbag, but he's a sort of a redemption story throughout. And honestly, okay, I'm going to be perfectly honest. Swan Song was actually winning this one until I actually got to Larry Underwood and, thought about his redemption arc throughout the story and how he went from this skis-ball, drug-addicted rock star to essentially being the sort of person who would sacrifice himself for the greater good. And it's just this fantastic story, so I'm sorry, Swan Song, but I'm going to have to give main characters to The Stand. Supporting characters. This is going to be a really short section. Why? Because as good as the supporting characters are in both of them, outside of Rusty, I can't think of the name of any side character or supporting character in Swan Song. There's a bunch of them, and they all play very important parts, and they're all very well written, they're all very well done, but I can't name any of them outside of Rusty, and he spent a lot of time with them. Except maybe like Robin. But I don't know if Robin count. Robin's not really a supporting character or a main character. He's just kind of a character who shows up like halfway through the book, maybe like 2/3 into the book, and is then just a character throughout. He's Swan's love interest. But for the most part, yeah, I really can't name any actual supporting characters outside of Rusty and maybe Robin. Where The Stand, I can name the Judge, Susan, Diane, Steve something or other, the Rat Man. The fact that I can even remember the names actually says a lot for who these supporting characters are. They may not play huge roles throughout the story, but they do play memorable roles. These are memorable characters. So, unfortunately, for the third time, for 3 points in a row, I gotta give it to The Stand. But what good are the main characters and the supporting characters without the villains? And I'm going to be splitting this into two different categories because they both kind of share two different styles of two different styles of villain. They have the human villains and they have the supernatural villain. And I am going to go through the supernatural villain with this one. In The Stand, it's Randall Flagg. In Swan Song, it's the Man with the Scarlet Eye. Both of these are essentially the devil figure or the demon figure through the story. They're both supernatural. They're both capable of immense power, and they both get defeated in the end because, obviously. They're both very powerful. They both play very important roles. They're both actively working against the protagonists as well as the Jesus figure, which I'll get into. So, basically to settle this, I am going to essentially explain the introduction to both these characters. And that should be enough to determine which of these is the better devil figure. Randall Flagg. When we first meet Randall Flagg, he is walking down the road. That's it. And all we really get is a description of him and a sort of who he is and his past. That is our introduction to Randall Flagg. Our introduction to the Man with the Scarlet Eye is him sitting alone in a movie theater watching The Faces of Death, laughing his ass off. But that's not it. When the movie ends, he comes up to the person, up to the teller, says that he wants to see it again, and essentially warps reality around himself to make it so he can go and watch the movie again. Because they weren't going to play the movie again, but he made it so they played the movie again. And we're coming at it from the perspective of the theater teller, and he's seeing the Man with the Scarlet Eyes face shifting. At first he appears one way, but then he appears a different way, and then he appears a different way. And you just get way more of a creepy image from the Man with the Scarlet Eye in terms of his first interaction than you do with Randall Flagg. And Randall Flagg, as a character, both characters have their little bit of a meltdown when it comes to the stuff that's going on around them. Randall Flagg's, though, deals with him being completely incapable of controlling the people in Las Vegas, where the Man with the Scarlet Eye is almost frightened when he first interacts with Swan. Not because of her power, but because of how genuinely kind she is. One of the first things she does is she offers him an apple. And that scares the hell out of him because he can't corrupt her. He can corrupt almost anybody, but he can't corrupt her. And frankly, I think that makes just for an incredible supernatural villain. Randall Flagg is fine for what he is, but he's really inconsequential in a lot of ways, and he's very, very much... he's very juvenile in a lot of ways. Where the Man with the Scarlet Eye, he has a plan. He's capable of doing a lot of different things. And he actually almost achieves his goals in a way where Randall Flagg never could. So, first point for Swan Song. Next, I'm going to talk about the human villains. The human villains in The Stand revolve mostly around Lloyd and Nadine. There are other ones like Trash Can Man, but Trash Can Man is in so little of the book, and from what I understand, the majority of his story wasn't even really in the main book. It didn't really come in until the uncut edition. Like, Trash Can Man was in it, yes, but a lot of his scenes were cut. So that really just goes to show just how little impact the character makes until the very end, which I'll get into. And so, otherwise we have like Lloyd and Nadine. And Lloyd and Nadine are fine for what they are. Like, Lloyd is Flagg's right-hand man for the most part, and Nadine is kind of like a foil to Larry. And I guess there's Harold, but Harold is Harold. Harold is kind of Franny's foil and Stu's foil, I suppose. But outside of like one act that he does throughout the entirety of the book, it's not enough for me to really classify him as a major human villain. He's just kind of a pawn who does one really awful thing. Nadine, she's just sort of a stooge for Randall Flagg. Like, she's supposed to be his bride, but it kind of becomes unwilling in the end. And then you have Lloyd, who is essentially a bank robber who didn't actually kill anybody, but was sent to prison for murder, despite not actually doing it. It was the person he was with. I mean, he's an accessory to murder, I suppose, but whatever. And him as a character, he's just kind of flat, if I'm being perfectly honest. In Swan Song, we have two major human villains. Like, there's a few others sprinkled throughout, but like the Fat Man, for example, but he's more of a villain to the villains, and he's only around for just a little while anyway. So you have Colonel Macklin and Roland. Roland was 12 during the time of the blast, and Colonel Macklin is an ex-veteran, or is a veteran, I suppose, and he is basically running this bunker project where people can get in for a little while, just kind of like a weekend getaway sort of thing, you know, just in case the bombs drop, sort of thing. Well, the bombs dropped all right, and there were very few survivors. Roland and Macklin were one of the two that survived. They ended up taking over this army, which they renamed the Army of Excellence, and it's kind of a Nazi mirror sort of thing. It's very interesting. It's very fascinating. But what's really interesting is following these characters and seeing how what's going on shifts in their mind. Like, Colonel Macklin has this shadow soldier going on in his head that he sees every once in a while, who tells him to buck up and be a man, be the soldier. And he's essentially teaching Roland this, and not that like that's particularly difficult when it comes to Roland, because Roland essentially starts off the story as a bit of a psychopath. So you kind of get these two characters who are super dynamic and super interesting throughout the entire story. And while you definitely don't want them to succeed, in the end anyway, you definitely want to see what happens with them as the story progresses, and how this army ends up growing, and all this other wonderful and really interesting shit. So, another point for Swan Song. Next up, I want to talk about the Jesus, what I call the Jesus figure. In The Stand, it is Mother Abigail. In Swan Song, it is Swan. Swan is a little girl at the start, but she has the ability to grow plants. She can essentially turn infertile soil fertile, and in a way that will grow whatever seed may happen to be in that soil at the time. This is a really, really useful power when it comes to, say, the aftermath of a nuclear explosion. Now, Swan being a child at the time of the explosion, there's not really a whole lot that she can do. But as she grows, she kind of learns to discover her power, and she essentially almost creates a little bit of a paradise despite the nuclear winter. And it's actually really interesting. It's kind of fascinating to watch all that happen. And she becomes a leader. She becomes all these wonderful things. And then we have Mother Abigail from The Stand. And Mother Abigail is this sweet, wonderful, charming old woman who shows up in people's dreams, and she tells people to come and see her, but she only shows out to the good people, or the people who have potential for good in them. You know, Larry was not a good person, but she saw the good in him and showed up in his dreams. Now, she as a person did not personally go to each person's dream, but that doesn't mean that she wasn't aware of what was going on. Supposedly, she talks to God. Whether or not God talks back to her is left a little ambiguous and might not have been the case. She as well becomes a bit of a leader. What she says goes, whether or not it's intended to be what she wants to have happen. You know, the society's kind of kicking itself back off, but they're trying to look to Mother Abigail for guidance, and she's kind of going, I don't want this. But then she kind of does, and she disappears because she found herself guilty for the sin of pride, and she eventually kicks off the last little bit of the book. As much as I love Swan's story, as much as I love her power and how she grows as a character, Mother Abigail just kind of has all of that natural Jesus spirit to her. So, as a character, Swan is a much better character than Mother Abigail. Hands down, bar none. Mother Abigail, however, is a better Jesus figure. She is the better light in the darkness. She is the better gatherer. So, I'm going to have to give this one to The Stand. And now the bit I should have mentioned like a long time ago. The apocalypses. Which one has the better apocalypse? One detailing a virus, one detailing the aftermath of a nuclear explosion. This one's not fair, and I can't pick which one's better. We're recently kind of, sort of coming out of a pandemic, and seeing a lot of the parallels and a lot of the similarities as to what happened between real life and The Stand really makes it eerie and spooky, because there's a lot of similarities, and I think if COVID had been way more deadly than what it was, things might have gone almost similar to how The Stand went, which is terrifying to think about. Whereas Swan Song, nuclear war has been a very real possibility for a very, very long time now. It's almost impossible to think of a time where nuclear war hasn't been a reality. Is it going to happen? Who knows? Are we in a war that would have that definite sort of thing? Probably not. But with all that said, the aftermath of a nuclear war is also just really, really interesting. I mean, that's why the Fallout games are as popular as they are, is because, I mean, outside of the natural fantasy realm of fallout. You get that nuclear war, like, you get that nuclear wasteland, which is, it's just interesting, because you really get to see these characters, you really get to see this setting for what it is, and I gotta give this one a draw. I genuinely have to give this one a draw. All right, now let's get out of all the character and story stuff, and let's get into the nitty-gritty aspects. The writing. This book is huge, and this book is the epitome of why I don't read Stephen King anymore. Don't get me wrong, this book is good. I loved it way more when I was in high school. I recently went through it again and didn't have the same love for it. But that doesn't mean that it's a bad book by any definition. But goddamn is it wordy. And goddamn could it stand to have been cut down a lot. I mean, ironically, this is the complete and uncut edition. And the original version is probably much more cut down than this. But regardless, it could have stood for way more cutting, and from what I heard was cut from it, like, I've never read the original version, I've only read the uncut version, but from what I understand of the original version, the stuff that I felt could have been cut was not the stuff that was cut from the original. You know, I had mentioned Franny and her mother being cut from the original, and Trash Can Man's journey with the kid being cut. Granted, those are not entirely important toward the story, but they're really important toward the characters. I just felt like it really could have been cut down a lot. Like, there were a lot of moments where I just felt like, or I basically just told the book, oh my god, get on with it. Which is not something I had with Swan Song. This book is very tight. It's very well put together. There isn't a scene that goes on, at least as far as I'm concerned, that goes on too long. There are no descriptions that continue on and on and on and on. There's no backstories that go on and on and on and on. Like, don't get me wrong, you get the backstories that you need with these characters. You get what you need with these characters, but the thickness of this book is necessary to tell the story. It is not entirely there for fluff. So, writing straight up just goes to Swan Song. Alright, now we're going to talk about the ending. The ending of Swan Song mostly goes around with the Man with the Scarlet Eye wanting to destroy the planet. Essentially, the government has nuclear warheads planted in 2 different places that would essentially destroy all life on the planet. Probably even destroy the planet in and of itself. And these characters being drugged to this place to speak to God and destroy the planet. And the main characters stopping that from happening. And it's done very neat, it's done very tidy, it's done very cleverly, and it's just done very well. And then right at the very end, Swan goes off with Robin to essentially make the planet fertile again. She starts off with one farm, and then she just spreads out from there. And it's got a little bit of a feel-good ending to it. Despite everything that goes on in the book, it just has that nice feel-good ending to it. The Stan's ending. Stu and all them go to Las Vegas. Stu doesn't make it there because of a broken leg. New Las Vegas blows up because Trash Can Man brings a nuke there. Tom Cullen comes and rescues Stu. They get caught in a snowstorm and all that, and eventually they make their way back to Boulder. Stu and Franny and stay around for a little while, but then eventually end up going back to Maine. Now, it's pretty clear that Swan Song is the better ending. Don't get me wrong, both have very good endings. Both have very solid endings. Stephen King's ending tends to go on and on and on and on and on and on and on because he doesn't know when to fucking just do a jump cut in terms of the story. But they're both very solid endings. I'm giving it to Swan Song. Straight up, just giving it to Swan Song. But I'm giving it to Swan Song for one reason alone. The goddamn Deus Ex Machina at the end of The Stand. When the hand of God, the literal hand of God, causes the nuclear bomb to explode. Like, what? That's how you want to go about this? Not a faulty triggering mechanism that could potentially leave that ambiguous as to whether or not, God caused it or anything like that. Or, anything to that effect. Nope, it's the literal hand of God. Essentially, Randall Flagg causes some energy thing which reforms itself to the hand of God, which causes the bomb to explode. And I'm... Even now, I roll my eyes at that ending, because it's just so bad. It is so much of a Deus Ex Machina, and I hate that. Genuinely hate it. So, the ending goes to Swan Song. Alright, this is it, folks. The last spot. And this is the tiebreaker. This is the one that determines which one of these books is better. Which one of these is better? And it'll be what would happen if you removed the supernatural elements from this story. Which one could potentially still go on as it went on for the most part. I mean, there would obviously be some major changes in both the story and the characters, but which one would still progress on in a similar pattern or similar path without the supernatural element? And it's super easy to figure this one out. It's Swan Song. It is absolutely Swan Song. Because without the supernatural element in The Stand, you don't have all these characters going to Las Vegas and Boulder. You have these characters spread out. And eventually starting, a whole bunch of little communities and stuff like that. Much like how Swan Song went. After its apocalypse. A bunch of people started a whole bunch of little communities, and it was kind of a dog-eat-dog world. Swan Song, up until the point where Swan causes a whole bunch of corn to grow, would have gone almost the exact same way. Bombs go off, Josh protects Swan against all these characters, against all this shit that's going on. And then eventually the nuclear winter happens, and they survive all throughout that. The only thing that doesn't happen is the supernatural elements, which essentially means that the chances of them being met with the Army of Excellence goes down quite a bit. And that's really about it, because there's no reason why any of them would want to go to the mountains to go and see God, because it's not really God, obviously, but, there wouldn't really be any reason to go there, because that was the Mammoth Scarlet Eyes idea. The Army of Excellence would have just eventually taken over the entirety of the United States, and probably a little bit of Canada, too, if Canada wasn't just a frozen wasteland by that point. So, the ending straight up just goes to, or the point goes to Swan Song. So yes, Swan Song is the better book. I mean, this is all my opinion anyway, but I did try and be as objective as possible and as honest as I possibly could with them. Should you read these books? Yes. Read them. They are very good books. If you want to, I would even recommend them on Audible. If you just can't find this time to sit down and read, but you have a bit of a commute to work, just get them on Audible. They're read by very talented people. They're done very well. These books are fantastic. Is really what all this comes down to. Doing this kind of gave me a little bit more of an appreciation for The Stand. I mean, Swan Song is still my favorite book of all time, so there might be a little bit of bias in there, but I do believe that Swan Song, it just is the better book, all in all. So, that's all I got for you guys. Be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, you know, all that YouTube-y bullshit. And, if there's anything you'd like me to cover in terms of writing or storycraft or anything of that matter, really, let me know in the comments. I plan to have a video for you guys at least once every 2 weeks. If I can do it more, then I will, but between work and school and writing, it's kind of, I think every 2 weeks is reasonable. But anyway, that's all I got for you guys, so have a good one. Oh, also, check out my books. I'm an author. Check out my books. I have links in the description. Check them out. They're fantastic. They've got pretty good reviews and ratings so far. Some of them are a little bit more spread out, but they got pretty good ratings and reviews so far. So check them out. I've got 5 of them so far. And yeah, okay, that's all I got for you guys. So have a good one, folks.